He brought his mistress into his house, then turned to his pregnant wife and decided to prove he was a man. What happened next shocked an entire community, and nearly cost an innocent life. Before we continue, ensure to like this video, share, subscribe and turn on notifications for more African life stories like this one. Let's dive in. David Okorie was the kind of man people pointed at and smiled. In the neighborhood of Green Valley Estate, his name carried weight. Men greeted him with respect. Women spoke of him with admiration. Young boys wished to grow up like him. David is a responsible man, people often said. He married well, others added. God has really blessed that family. David owned a small but successful electronics business in town. Every Sunday, he wore clean shirts, shiny shoes, and walked proudly beside his pregnant wife, Grace, to church. He smiled easily. He shook hands firmly. He dropped offerings generously. From the outside, David Okorie looked like a perfect man. But inside the walls of his home, another David lived there. Grace stood in the kitchen that evening, stirring a pot of vegetable soup slowly. Her back ached. Her feet were swollen. She was 7 months pregnant, and the baby inside her kicked often, as if reminding her of its presence. She winced softly and rested one hand on her belly. "Easy, my little one," she whispered. "Mama is here." The kitchen smelled of palm oil and spices. Grace had cooked David's favorite meal, pounded yam and vegetable soup with plenty of meat. She always tried her best, even when her body begged her to rest. She heard the front door open. David was home. Grace quickly wiped her hands on her apron and forced a small smile onto her face. She knew better than to look tired when David returned. Tiredness irritated him. "Good evening, David," she said softly as he walked in. David didn't answer immediately. He dropped his car keys loudly on the table and loosened his tie. "Is food ready?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yes," Grace replied quickly. "I just finished. Let me dish it for you." She hurried to serve him. David sat down, scrolling through his phone, his eyes glued to the screen. A faint smile appeared on his face, a smile Grace had not seen directed at her in a long time. Grace noticed it. She hesitated for a second, then placed the food in front of him. "Thank you," she said. David grunted and continued typing on his phone. Grace sat opposite him quietly. She watched him eat. He barely looked at her. "David," she said carefully, choosing her words like fragile glass, "the doctor said we should come for the scan together next week." David didn't respond. "David," she tried again. He sighed heavily and dropped his spoon. "Grace, must you always disturb me with useless talk?" he snapped. Grace flinched. I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I just thought." "You thought wrong," David cut in. "I have work. Serious work. Not hospital gossip." Grace lowered her eyes. "I understand," she whispered. David picked up his phone again. Almost immediately, it rang. He glanced at the screen, then stood up quickly. "I need to take this," he said and walked away toward the bedroom. Grace watched his back disappear. Something heavy settled in her chest. She knew that call. Inside the bedroom, David closed the door and answered the phone. "Hello, Vanessa," he said, his voice suddenly softer. On the other end, Vanessa Cole smiled. Vanessa was beautiful in a loud, obvious way. She loved flashy clothes, long nails, and expensive perfumes. She was younger than Grace, bolder, and always hungry for attention. "Did I disturb you?" Vanessa asked sweetly. David chuckled. "Never. I was just eating." "With her?" Vanessa asked, her tone changing slightly. David hesitated. "Yes." Vanessa scoffed. "You still sit and eat with that woman like she's a queen?" "She's my wife," David replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "And I'm what?" Vanessa snapped. "A secret." David leaned against the wall. "You know that's not true." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "David, you talk too much. Actions speak louder than words." David frowned. What do you want me to do? Vanessa paused for a moment, then said slowly, I want to know that I matter more. David swallowed. I do a lot for you, he said. Vanessa's voice turned sharp. But you still go home every night and play the loving husband. You still protect her. She's pregnant, David muttered. So? Vanessa replied coldly. Does pregnancy make her a goddess? David said nothing. Vanessa continued, her words dripping with poison. Sometimes I feel like you're weak, David. Like you're afraid of her. David straightened up. I'm not afraid of anyone. Then prove it, Vanessa said. David clenched his jaw. How? Vanessa smiled on the other end of the phone. Show me that you are the man in that house. The line went quiet. Grace sat alone in the living room, listening to the sound of David's voice through the bedroom door. She couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone. Soft, amused, intimate. Her heart sank. She rested both hands on her belly and closed her eyes. God, she whispered, please protect my child. She remembered the early days of her marriage. David used to hold her hand in public. He used to call her, my queen. He used to kneel beside her and pray at night. When had everything changed? The bedroom door opened. David walked out, his face hard again. I'm going out, he said. At this time, Grace asked gently. You haven't finished eating. I've lost my appetite, he replied. Grace stood up slowly. Should I pack some food for you? David turned sharply. Did I ask you to? Grace froze. No. Then stop asking stupid questions, he snapped. Grace nodded quickly. I'm sorry. David grabbed his jacket and walked out without another word. The door slammed behind him. Grace sank back onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. The baby kicked again. I'm trying, she whispered. I'm really trying. She didn't know that this night was only the beginning. Vanessa sat in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She adjusted her wig, applied more lip gloss, and crossed her legs slowly. She loved attention. She loved being desired. But tonight, something irritated her deeply. David's hesitation. She picked up her phone and replayed his words in her head. She's pregnant. Vanessa scoffed aloud. So what? She muttered. Am I invisible? Her phone buzzed. David, I'm coming over. A smile crept onto her face. An hour later, David arrived. Vanessa opened the door wearing a short silk robe. The smell of expensive perfume filled the air. You took long, she said. David walked in and closed the door behind him. Traffic. Vanessa laughed. Traffic, or your wife? David frowned. Why do you always bring her up? Vanessa turned to him sharply. Because she's always between us. David sighed and sat down. Vanessa walked slowly toward him, then sat on his lap. You know I care about you, she said, running her fingers along his neck. David leaned back slightly. Then stop testing me. Vanessa pulled away and stood up. Testing you? She repeated. David, I want to know where I stand in your life. You know I can't leave her now, David said. She's pregnant. Vanessa laughed loudly. Ah, there it is again. She walked away and poured herself a drink. So tell me, she said, turning back to him, will she always control your life? David stood up. She doesn't control me. Then why does everything revolve around her? Vanessa asked. Her pregnancy. Her feelings. Her tears. David clenched his fists. Watch your mouth. Vanessa smiled, unafraid. Or what? David stared at her. Vanessa stepped closer. You talk like a strong man, David. But you act like a weak one. That word hit him hard. Weak. She continued. A real man controls his home. A real man is feared. David's chest rose and fell rapidly. You don't know what you're saying, he said. Vanessa leaned in and whispered, "I know exactly what I'm saying." She pulled back and looked him straight in the eyes. "If you can't show me that you're the man in that house, then maybe I chose the wrong person." David's pride flared. "What do you want?" he asked. Vanessa smiled slowly. "I want to see it. I want proof." "Proof of what?" "That you value me more," she replied. "That you're not controlled by a pregnant woman who cries every time." David said nothing. Vanessa crossed her arms. "Bring me to your house." David's eyes widened. "Are you mad? Are you scared?" she challenged. David felt his blood boil. "No," he said quickly. "Then prove it," Vanessa said. "Let me see your world. Let me see how much power you really have." David hesitated. Vanessa turned away. "If you can't do it, then leave. I don't want half men." Silence filled the room. David's jaw tightened. "I'll show you," he said finally. Vanessa turned back slowly, a dangerous smile on her face. "When?" she asked. "Soon," David replied. Vanessa stepped closer and kissed his cheek. "I'll be waiting," she said. David left her apartment with his heart pounding, not with love, but with wounded pride. He didn't realize that he had already crossed a line he could never return from. Grace did not sleep that night. She lay on her side, facing the wall, listening to the ticking sound of the clock in the living room. Each tick felt loud, like it was counting something terrible that was coming closer. Tick, tick, tick. David had not returned home. Grace placed one hand on her stomach and gently rubbed it. "Why are you so restless tonight?" she whispered to the baby. "Is it me you're feeling, or something else?" The baby kicked softly, then harder. Grace swallowed and closed her eyes. She remembered the first time she realized David had changed. It was not sudden. It was slow, like a crack in a wall that kept spreading until the house became unsafe. Before she got pregnant, David had already started coming home late. When she asked him where he had been, he would snap. "Are you my mother? Do you think I'm a child? Must you question everything I do?" Grace learned to stay quiet. When she became pregnant, she thought things would get better. She was wrong. David became more distant, more angry, more impatient. He hated when she moved slowly. He hated when she complained about pain. He hated when she cried. "Pregnancy is not a sickness," he would say. "My mother gave birth to 6 children and still worked on the farm." Grace would nod, even when her back felt like it was breaking. That morning, David returned home just before sunrise. Grace heard the door open and quickly pretended to be asleep. David walked into the bedroom and removed his shoes carelessly. The smell of alcohol followed him. Grace's heart beat fast. He lay down beside her without a word. Grace stayed still, afraid to move. Minutes passed. Then David spoke. "You didn't lock the gate last night," he said. Grace turned slowly. I thought you were coming back soon." "So?" he snapped. "Does that mean you should be careless?" "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. David laughed coldly. "Sorry won't protect this house." Grace said nothing. David rolled over and slept. Grace stared at the ceiling, tears sliding silently into her hair. Later that morning, Grace visited her mother, Mama Ruth. Mama Ruth sold vegetables in the market. Her hands were rough from years of hard work, but her eyes were warm and sharp. When Grace walked into the small room behind the market stall, Mama Ruth looked up and frowned. "You've lost weight," she said immediately. Grace forced a smile. "It's the pregnancy." Mama Ruth stood up and held Grace's face gently. "Look at me," she said. Grace hesitated, then raised her eyes. Mama Ruth sighed deeply. "My daughter," she said quietly, "your eyes are heavy." Grace tried to laugh. "Mama, it's nothing." Mama Ruth did not smile. "Sit," she said. Grace sat. Mama Ruth brought water and placed it in front of her. "Drink." Grace obeyed. Mama Ruth sat across from her. "Tell me." Grace shook her head quickly. "There's nothing to tell." Mama Ruth leaned closer. "Grace, I carried you in my womb. I know when something is wrong." Grace's lips trembled. "Mama," she whispered, "I'm tired." Mama Ruth nodded. "I can see." Grace stared at the floor. "David is under pressure," she added quickly, like she was defending him. "Business is stressful." Mama Ruth was silent for a long moment. "Does he hit you?" she asked softly. Grace's head snapped up. "No. Never." Mama Ruth studied her face. "Does he shout at you?" Grace hesitated. "He gets angry sometimes," she said carefully. Mama Ruth sighed. "Anger is not love," she said. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Mama, I don't want trouble. I just want peace." Mama Ruth reached across the table and held her hand. "Peace should not cost you your life," she said gently. Grace pulled her hand back. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Please don't worry." Mama Ruth did not argue. But her heart was heavy. As Grace stood to leave, Mama Ruth said, "If you ever feel unsafe, come here. Day or night." Grace nodded, though she did not believe she would ever be brave enough. That evening, Grace cooked again. She always cooked. Cooking was one of the few things she could still control. She prepared rice and stew. She washed David's clothes. She cleaned the house slowly, stopping often to catch her breath. When David came home, he was unusually quiet. Grace noticed it immediately. "How was work?" she asked carefully. "Fine," he replied. He ate silently. Grace watched him, her heart uneasy. Something was different. David kept checking his phone, smiling, typing. Grace's chest tightened. "David," she said, "is everything okay?" David dropped his spoon. "Grace," he said slowly, "do you enjoy asking unnecessary questions?" "No," she said quickly. "I just—" "Then stop," he snapped. Grace nodded and stood up to clear the plates. As she walked away, she heard him say under his breath, "You women talk too much." Grace froze for a second, then continued walking. That night, she prayed longer than usual. "God," she whispered, "please don't let my child grow up in fear." She did not know that fear was already knocking on her door. 2 days later, David came home early. That alone was strange. Grace was in the kitchen when she heard the gate open. She smiled faintly. "Maybe today will be different," she whispered to herself. She wiped her hands and walked into the living room. David stood there, adjusting his shirt. "You're home early," Grace said gently. "Yes," David replied. Grace noticed something else. He was dressed too neatly. His cologne was strong. His shoes were polished. "Is there a meeting?" she asked. David looked at her sharply. "Why?" "No reason," she said quickly. "I was just asking." David looked away. "I have someone coming," he said. Grace blinked. "Someone?" "Yes." Grace's heart skipped. "Who?" she asked. David met her eyes. "A friend." Grace felt cold. "A friend," she repeated. "Now." "Yes," David said. "Is there a problem?" Grace hesitated. "I just didn't expect visitors," she said. "The house is not." "It's fine," David cut in. "Just make sure you behave yourself." Grace frowned slightly. "Behave." David stepped closer. "Don't embarrass me." Grace nodded slowly. "I won't," she said. David walked into the bedroom and locked the door. Grace stood alone in the living room, her heart pounding. Something was very wrong. An hour later, there was a knock at the gate. Grace jumped. She looked at the time. It was already dark. She walked slowly to the gate and opened it. Vanessa stood there, tall, confident, dressed in a tight red dress, smiling. Yes. Grace asked, confused. Vanessa looked her up and down slowly, her eyes stopping at Grace's stomach. Oh, Vanessa said with a smirk. So you're Grace. Grace felt her throat tighten. Yes, she replied. Who are you? Vanessa smiled wider. I'm Vanessa, David's friend. The word friend felt heavy. Grace forced politeness. Please come in. Vanessa walked in like she owned the place. She looked around the living room, touching things without permission. So this is where you live, she said. It's simple. Grace swallowed. Please sit. Vanessa sat without waiting to be asked. Is David home? She asked. Yes, Grace replied. Let me call him. Before Grace could move, David came out of the bedroom. Vanessa, he said. Grace turned sharply. Vanessa stood up immediately. David, she said sweetly. They hugged. Grace felt like the floor disappeared beneath her feet. David did not look at Grace. Did she offer you a seat? He asked Vanessa. Yes, Vanessa replied, still smiling. David nodded. Good. Grace stood there, invisible. Grace, David said without looking at her, go and bring drinks. Grace hesitated. David, she said softly, who is she? David finally turned to her. Didn't you hear? He said coldly. She's my friend. Vanessa crossed her arms and looked at Grace with open mockery. You didn't tell her about me? Vanessa asked David. David shrugged. There was no need. Grace felt dizzy. A friend, she repeated slowly. What kind of friend? David's eyes darkened. Grace, he warned, don't start. Vanessa laughed lightly. Relax, darling. She's just curious. Grace felt tears burn her eyes. David, she said, her voice shaking, this is my home. David stepped closer. And I'm the man of this house, he said quietly. Remember that. Grace covered her stomach instinctively. Vanessa watched the movement and smiled cruelly. So, Vanessa said, you're pregnant. Grace nodded. Yes. Vanessa tilted her head. Must be nice. To feel secure. Grace said nothing. David turned to Grace. Drinks. Grace walked to the kitchen, her legs weak. Her hands shook as she poured the drinks. In the kitchen, she leaned against the counter and breathed heavily. What is happening? She whispered. She carried the tray back to the living room. Vanessa and David were sitting close, laughing. Grace placed the drinks on the table quietly. Vanessa looked at her and said casually, you should relax more. Stress is bad for pregnancy. Grace stared at her. David said nothing. Grace realized something terrible in that moment. David was not embarrassed. He was proud. And whatever was coming next would not be stopped. Grace stood in the kitchen longer than necessary. Her hands rested on the counter, trembling. Her chest felt tight, like the air had suddenly become too heavy to breathe. From the living room, she could hear David's laughter. Loud, confident, carefree. She had not heard him laugh like that in a long time. And certainly not with her. Vanessa's voice floated into the kitchen too. Smooth. Mocking. Comfortable. Grace swallowed hard. This is my home, she whispered to herself. This is my husband. But the truth felt different now. She picked up the tray and slowly walked back into the living room. David and Vanessa stopped laughing when they saw her. Vanessa's eyes moved deliberately from Grace's face to her stomach. Wow, Vanessa said casually. You're really far gone. Grace stiffened. Yes, she replied quietly. 7 months. Vanessa nodded slowly. That means you must be very emotional. Grace frowned. Excuse me. Vanessa smiled. Pregnant women are always dramatic. Grace looked at David. He said nothing. That silence hurt more than words. Grace placed the tray on the table and turned to leave. Wait, Vanessa said. Grace stopped. Vanessa leaned back and crossed her legs. "Sit with us." Grace hesitated. I need to rest." David spoke sharply. "Did you not hear her?" Grace slowly sat down, her heart racing. Vanessa tilted her head. "So, Grace, how long have you and David been married?" 5 years, Grace answered. Vanessa laughed softly. "Only 5. Grace said nothing. "And you already look so tired," Vanessa continued. "Marriage must be hard for you." Grace's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. "Vanessa," David said, though there was no warning in his tone. Vanessa raised her hands. "I'm just talking." Grace took a deep breath. "Please, I don't feel well." Vanessa leaned forward. "Then maybe you should stop pretending everything is fine." Grace looked at David again. "David," she said softly, "can I speak to you privately?" David frowned. "About what?" "Please," she begged. Vanessa laughed loudly. "Oh no, no secrets. I want to hear too." David waved his hand dismissively. "Say it." Grace's voice shook. "Why is she here?" Vanessa answered before David could. "Because he invited me." Grace's heart dropped. "David," she whispered. David stood up. "Grace," he said slowly, "you're embarrassing me." Her eyes widened. "Embarrassing you?" "Yes," he snapped. "Look at you. Always questioning. Always crying." "I'm not crying," Grace said, though tears filled her eyes. Vanessa stood up too. "Honestly," she said, "I don't know how you live with this every day." Grace stood up unsteadily. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "this is my home. You don't have to humiliate me." Vanessa smirked. "Humiliate you? You humiliate yourself." That was when David lost control. "Enough!" he shouted. Grace jumped. Vanessa stepped back slightly, surprised, but quickly recovered. David turned to Grace, his face dark. "I brought her here to show you something," he said. Grace shook her head. "Show me what?" "That I'm tired of your weakness," he replied. "Your tears. Your fear." "I'm pregnant," Grace said softly. "I'm carrying your child." "And," David shouted, "does that make you special?" Vanessa watched silently now, her eyes wide. Grace placed a hand over her stomach instinctively. "David, please," she begged. "Not in front of her." That sentence did something terrible. David laughed. "You see," he said to Vanessa. "Always begging." Grace's knees felt weak. "David," she whispered, "please calm down." "Calm down," he repeated. "You think I'm angry?" He stepped closer. Grace stepped back. Her back hit the wall. Vanessa's face changed. The smile disappeared. "David," she said uncertainly, "maybe—" "Stay out of it," he snapped. Grace shook her head desperately. "David, stop." But he didn't. His words came like blows. "You're useless. You're a burden. You think pregnancy gives you power." Grace sobbed openly now. "Please," she cried. "Think of the baby." That was when neighbors heard shouting. David moved closer, towering over her. Vanessa backed away slowly. "David," she said again, fear in her voice now, "this is not what I meant." But David didn't hear her. Grace slid down the wall, protecting her stomach. Her voice became weak. "My baby," she whispered. David froze when he saw her on the floor. For a second, the room went silent. Then Grace cried out in pain. Vanessa screamed. "Oh my God!" David stepped back, suddenly pale. Grace felt something warm and terrifying. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Her vision blurred. "David," Vanessa said shakily, "there's blood." David looked down. His world stopped. The screams brought people running. Neighbors rushed to the gate. Someone banged on the door. "What's happening? Open this door." "Is that Grace screaming?" David stood frozen, staring at Grace on the floor. "David," she whispered weakly. Vanessa backed into a corner, shaking. "I didn't want this," she murmured. "I didn't want this." David knelt beside Grace, his hands shaking. "Grace," he said, his voice suddenly small, "get up." She couldn't. Her body felt heavy. Her stomach ached terribly. "Help, the baby," she whispered. Blood stained the floor. Vanessa began to cry. "Oh God, oh God." A neighbor forced the door open. "What did you do?" someone shouted. Another woman screamed when she saw Grace. "Call a hospital. Call the police." David's mind spun. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered. Vanessa pushed past everyone and ran out. "I can't be here," she cried. "I can't." She disappeared into the night. Grace was lifted carefully by neighbors. She barely felt it. Everything went dark. Grace woke up to beeping sounds. Bright lights. Pain. She tried to move her hand. "Don't move," a voice said gently. Grace opened her eyes slowly. Mama Ruth stood beside her bed, tears streaming down her face. "My daughter," she sobbed. "My child." Grace tried to speak. Her throat was dry. "The baby," she whispered. Mama Ruth squeezed her hand. "The baby is alive," she said through tears. "You're alive." Grace closed her eyes and cried silently. David sat alone in the hospital corridor. His clothes were stained. His hands shook uncontrollably. People stared at him with disgust. Inspector Mark Audet stood in front of him. "David Okery," the inspector said firmly, "you are under arrest." David looked up slowly. "For what?" he whispered. "For assault," the inspector replied, "and endangering the life of a pregnant woman." David's lips trembled. "It was an accident," he said weakly. The inspector shook his head. "Violence is never an accident." Handcuffs clicked shut. David bowed his head. Inside the hospital room, Grace lay quietly. She stared at the ceiling. Her body hurt. Her heart hurt more. But she was alive. And for the first time in a long time, she knew something had ended, and something else had begun. News spreads fast in African communities. By morning, almost everyone in Green Valley Estate knew what had happened in David Okery's house the night before. Some heard screams. Some saw the ambulance. Others saw the police car with flashing lights. But everyone had a story. "Did you hear what David did to his wife?" "I always knew that man was pretending." "Grace? The pregnant one?" "Ah, God forbid." People gathered in small groups, at the gate, near the shops, beside the road. Whispers turned into loud discussions. Shock turned into anger. The man everyone admired had fallen. Mama Ruth stood outside the hospital room, refusing to sit. She had not slept. Her wrapper was tied carelessly. Her eyes were red from crying, but her back was straight. She looked like a woman who had seen pain before, and survived it. A nurse approached her gently. "Mama, please sit down," the nurse said. "Your daughter is stable now." Mama Ruth nodded. "Thank you." She walked into the hospital room quietly. Grace lay on the bed, weak and pale. Tubes surrounded her. Machines beeped softly. Mama Ruth sat beside her and held her hand. "My child," she whispered. Grace opened her eyes slowly. "Mama," she said faintly. Tears rolled down Mama Ruth's cheeks. "I told you," she said softly. "I told you to come when you felt unsafe." Grace turned her face away. "I didn't want to break my home," she whispered. Mama Ruth squeezed her hand gently. "A home that breaks you is already broken." Grace closed her eyes. Outside the room, Pastor Elijah arrived. He had known David for years. They had prayed together, laughed together, shaken hands in church. He stood still when he heard the full story. "Is it true?" he asked Mama Ruth quietly. "Did David really?" Mama Ruth looked at him. "Yes," she said firmly. "In front of another woman." Pastor Elijah lowered his head in shame. "We failed her," he murmured. Mama Ruth shook her head. "No, he failed her." Later that day, Inspector Mark Audet returned. He spoke calmly, but his eyes were sharp. "Madam Grace," he said gently when he entered the room, "I need to take your statement when you're strong enough." Grace nodded weakly. Mama Ruth stood up. "She will speak," she said firmly. "But not today." Inspector Audet nodded. "That's fine." He hesitated, then added, "Your husband has been charged." Grace's heart tightened. "Where is he?" she asked softly. "In custody," the inspector replied. "He will answer for his actions." Grace said nothing. Across town, David sat in a small police cell. The walls were cold. The bench was hard. For the first time in his life, no one called him Sir. No one respected him. No one admired him. He replayed the night again and again in his mind. Grace on the floor. Vanessa screaming. Blood. His hands trembled. "This isn't me," he whispered. "This isn't who I am." But deep inside, he knew that was a lie. A police officer opened the cell door. "You have a visitor," the officer said. David looked up. Vanessa stood there. Her eyes were red. Her confidence was gone. "You came," David said, relieved. Vanessa didn't move closer. "I came to tell you something," she said coldly. David frowned. "Tell me what?" "I'm done," Vanessa said. "I want nothing to do with you." David stood up. "Vanessa, you don't understand." "No," she interrupted. "You don't understand." She pointed at him. "You're sick," she said. "I wanted attention, not murder." David's mouth opened slightly. "You pushed me." "Don't," she snapped. "I didn't beat your wife." "You did." Silence filled the room. Vanessa took a step back. "I hope she survives," she said quietly. "Because you won't survive what's coming." She turned and walked away. David sank back onto the bench. Alone. By evening, the story had reached social media. Someone posted, "Man beats pregnant wife in front of mistress. Wife rushed to hospital." The comments exploded. People who once praised David now condemned him. Women shared their own stories. Men spoke against violence. The community demanded justice. Grace's pain had opened a door many were afraid to open. 2 days later, Grace was strong enough to sit up. Her body still hurt, but her mind was clearer. Inspector Mark Audet returned with a recorder. "Madam Grace," he said gently, "are you ready to speak?" Grace looked at Mama Ruth. Mama Ruth nodded. "Yes," Grace said quietly. "I will speak." She took a deep breath. And she told the truth. She spoke of the insults, the fear, the humiliation. The night David brought another woman into their home. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. When she finished, the room was silent. Inspector Audet turned off the recorder slowly. "Thank you," he said. "You're very brave." Grace didn't feel brave. She felt tired. David stood before the magistrate a week later. He looked smaller, older. His lawyer whispered to him, but the words meant nothing. Grace was not in court. She was not ready. But Mama Ruth was there. So were neighbors, church members, women from the market. The magistrate read the charges. David's ears rang. He thought of his business, his reputation, his child, everything he wanted to protect, gone. The magistrate looked at him sternly. "This court does not tolerate violence," he said, "especially against women and unborn children. David lowered his head. For the first time, he felt shame, not fear, not anger, but true shame. Outside the court, reporters waited. "Do you have anything to say?" one asked David. He said nothing. Mama Ruth stepped forward instead. "My daughter will live," she said firmly. "And her child will live." Her voice did not shake. "That is what matters." That night, Grace sat by the hospital window. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance. She placed her hand on her stomach. "My child," she whispered, "I'm sorry it took me this long to be strong." The baby kicked gently. Grace smiled through tears. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew one thing for sure. Silence had almost killed her. And truth had saved her. Grace left the hospital quietly. There was no celebration. No music. No joy the way people usually expect after survival. But there was strength. Mama Ruth helped her into the car slowly, carefully, as if Grace were made of glass. Grace moved gently, one hand always on her stomach, the other holding her mother's arm. "You don't have to rush," Mama Ruth said softly. Grace nodded. "I know." As the car drove away, Grace looked back at the hospital building. That place had nearly become the end of her story. Instead, it became the beginning. Grace moved into her mother's small home behind the market. It was not big. It was not fancy. But it was safe. The first night there, Grace slept deeply for the first time in months. No shouting. No fear of footsteps. No sudden anger. Just silence. When she woke up, sunlight streamed through the small window. She lay there for a long time, breathing slowly. "I'm still here," she whispered. Days passed. Grace attended counseling sessions arranged by a women's support group. At first, she didn't want to speak. She sat quietly, listening to other women talk. One woman spoke of broken bones. Another spoke of insults that lasted years. Another cried about silence, how nobody believed her. Grace realized something painful. She was not alone. One afternoon, the counselor looked at Grace gently. "Would you like to share today?" she asked. Grace hesitated. Her hands shook. Then she spoke. "My name is Grace," she said quietly. "I almost lost my life because I thought enduring pain was love." The room was silent. She continued slowly. "I stayed because I was afraid. Afraid of shame. Afraid of starting over. Afraid of being alone." Her voice broke. "But I learned something," she said, tears falling freely now. "Staying almost killed me. Leaving saved me." The women around her nodded. Some cried with her. Grace felt lighter when she finished. David tried to reach her. From the police cell. From the remand home. Through lawyers. Through messages sent to Mama Ruth. "I want to apologize. I've changed. It was a mistake. Please forgive me." Grace read none of them. Mama Ruth handled everything. "My daughter is healing," Mama Ruth said firmly to anyone who asked. "She will speak when she is ready." Grace focused on her health. She ate better. She rested. She smiled again. Small smiles, but real ones. The baby grew stronger. Each kick reminded Grace why she survived. One evening, Grace stood outside watching the sunset. The sky was orange and purple. Children played nearby. Life continued. Mama Ruth joined her. "You're different," Mama Ruth said softly. Grace smiled faintly. "I feel different." Mama Ruth nodded. "Pain either breaks you or builds you." Grace placed her hand on her stomach. "I don't want my child to grow up thinking fear is normal," she said. Mama Ruth touched her shoulder. "And they won't." The court date came. Grace decided to attend. Not for revenge. Not for anger. But for closure. She walked into the courtroom slowly, supported by Mama Ruth. David saw her. Their eyes met. David looked away first. Grace did not hate him. She felt nothing. And that scared him more than anger ever could. When it was her turn to speak, Grace stood. Her voice was calm. "I loved my husband," she said. "I believed patience would change him." She paused. "But love should not destroy you," she continued. "Silence should not be the price of marriage." The courtroom was quiet. "I survived," Grace said. "And because I survived, I speak." David bowed his head. The judge thanked her. Grace sat down, exhausted, but free. David was sentenced, not just by the court, but by society. His business collapsed. Friends disappeared. The respect he once enjoyed turned into disgust. In his cell, he finally understood something too late. Power built on fear is not power. It is cruelty. He thought about his child. A child who might grow up knowing his father as a warning, not a protector. That thought haunted him more than prison ever could. Grace gave birth months later. It was a long night. Painful. Exhausting. But surrounded by love. Mama Ruth held her hand the entire time. When the baby cried for the first time, Grace cried too. She held her child close. "My miracle," she whispered. She named the baby Hope, because that was what survived. Grace's story spread, not as gossip, but as testimony. Women came to her quietly. "How did you leave? Where did you find strength?" "I'm afraid." Grace never judged. She listened. She spoke honestly. "I didn't leave because I was strong," she said. "I left because staying was killing me." Grace began working with a local organization that supported abused women. She spoke at churches, markets, and small community meetings. Her voice was calm, firm, real. Men listened too. Some ashamed. Some reflective. Some changed. One afternoon, Grace stood before a small crowd. She held her child close. "Abuse is not discipline," she said. "Silence is not peace. And love does not leave scars." The crowd was quiet. Her story echoed. That night, Grace stood outside again, looking at the stars. Her life was not perfect, but it was hers. She bent down and kissed her child's forehead. "You will grow up knowing love," she whispered. And somewhere, far away, a man sat in silence, learning too late that hurting a woman never proves strength. It only proves weakness. If this story touched you, don't stay silent. Like this video, share it, and subscribe to African Life Stories, because real stories save lives, and silence destroys them. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.